Hey, what's going on everyone? We're going to jump right into it given the nature of this video, the Glissen experience. Originally, this started as really just a thought experiment, something I was playing around with because I was curious. How effective is Tchter using non-Tchter weapons, specifically element weapons? Now, for those who might remember in Phantasy Star Online 2, element weapons was a necessity for Tchter. Wand element changed the entire element of the weapon, but of course as the meta shifted to Tchter Luster, needing to have 6 gun slashes to be effective was the thing. Now I know many of you were probably hoping that this isn't the case in NGS, and it might not be. Definitely wanted to explore these elemental weapons, specifically Glissen or the lightning weapons that we have in this month's anniversary event. Couple of things that we're going to go over in this experiment. We're going to have clips to kind of look at these things. You know, this isn't going to be the most pristine scientific method, but it does give us a sense of what we can think about. So of course, the main question, how effective is Tchter using non-Tchter elemental weapons? How effective are elemental downs with non-Tchter weapons? How effective is non-elemental explosions on wands compared to elemental explosions with these elemental weapons? And of course, damage output. Is this something that we can essentially use to be effective with any weapon with Tchter in the future? Methodology. In these clips, I'm only going to be using sword and wand, as I've only made one elemental weapon, which is a wand sword. Each run is only going to use that weapon's attacks. So for sword, anything that is accessible to sword will be used. For wand, anything accessible to wands. That means I will not be using Jazande. There will be no photon blast used during these runs. Wand nor sword will use Jazande. So once again, this is weapon attacks only. When comparing sword and wand, I will be removing the elemental explosions. So there will not be a lightning explosion, there will just be the physical explosion. And I'm doing this really to get a good sense of damage comparison by essentially reducing the potential damage that you can do with wand as much as possible. Other than that, let's get started. So what do we learn here? Wand, even without lightning explosions, is fairly adept at causing element downs. Chances are, if we were to add Jazande and add lightning explosions, the time that the enemy would be shocked would be much faster. What is interesting is that the enemy was not shocked while using sword. The question becomes, can sword cause shock elemental downs or lightning elemental downs? And the answer is yes. As you'll see in this next clip with Didal, it takes a while. Didal pretty much dies just after being shocked, but elemental weapons of all types can cause the downs. The next question we'll explore is, how much better or faster can element downs be caused when using a lightning explosion with Wand? So now what's interesting in this situation is that, as expected, the wand with the lightning element explosions caused shock faster. Granted, shock eventually occurred with the wand with just a physical explosion. Interestingly, the down element triggered on both conditions, roughly at the same time, knowing that there's some variability involved. This gets tricky because what this tells us is that physical down states are triggered by these weapons, but removing the element from the wand doesn't seem to give that much of a benefit. We can also chalk damage differences up to random variability in play and enemy attack patterns, and also due to the fact that the physical explosions weren't lightning, and so they did less damage overall. Another important takeaway from this condition is that when we compare this to sword, even though sword did cause an elemental down, it was at the very end of the lifespan of Tchter. Versus in these two conditions, it was much faster. So as we're thinking about elemental weapons, while they can cause downs, they're not as accessible as they are with tech weapons, or at least Techter weapons. But something tells me it might have something to do with how tech weapons are considered in these elemental down formulas. First, let's address the elephant in the room. Yes, in this run, sword outperformed wand. Now let's take a couple of things into consideration. First of all, wand did not have lightning element, nor was I using Jizande, which would have helped in not only the speed in which I downed Elder, but also the damage given. In addition, as I called out previously, down states, wand is not very effective. That's something that you're really going to want to consider when you're playing with wand, is that when an enemy is down, it really doesn't have the tools to effectively do a lot of damage. A lot of wand's damage is baked into wand parry activity from the enemy. So when the enemy is no longer active, a lot of that potential drops as well. In regards to element states, we saw with wand, shock or lightning triggered first. In comparison to sword, which happened a couple seconds later, a physical down occurred. Given our other conditions, this shouldn't be too surprising. We have evidence that suggests when using a non-tech weapon, elemental downs such as shock will occur later. They don't accumulate as fast, but it is good to see that physical downs do still accumulate fairly quickly. Now, I do want to call out one thing, and that is how physical downs are triggered. In Elder's case, its weak spot, which is the eye, is also a trigger point to down the enemy. But if we were to go to Tchter, its weak point, which is the chest, is not. So when you're using these elemental weapons, one of the things to take into consideration is if you are not triggering or hitting that down part or that down target, you will not get a down state. And the elemental down, or shock in this case, can and most likely will be delayed if you are not using a tech weapon, specifically wand. These are some things to consider. It has some benefits, but it also has some consequences depending on the situation, who you're fighting, and what you're targeting. As I mentioned previously, it can really come down to what you're targeting and who you are fighting. Unlike the Elder situation, in this condition, Wand beats Sword by a little bit, but once again, there was no lightning element explosion, there was no Jizandi, which could change things a little bit, especially given the fact that in this situation, neither condition caused an elemental down or a physical down. We could argue that with the addition of the lightning explosions and Jizande, the Wand would have downed Rock Bear, leading to additional down damage, ending the fight sooner than it did. Now, if we go back to our original question, which was how effective is Tchter when using non-Tchter weapons, I think we can say that they are viable, and that in certain situations, especially in situations where Wand or potentially Talis are not as effective, using another class's weapons as the main weapon for those situations can be beneficial. Of course, you're going to have to think very cautiously about what weapons you're going to use and what situations they're best to be used in. I think as we've seen through these conditions in this little experiment that it's not always going to be the answer, but there are some enemies that will just respond better to those weapons. Another thing that we're going to have to take into consideration is elemental downs and physical downs. Where are you targeting and what are you trying to do, given that these non-Tchter elemental weapons aren't going to necessarily cause an elemental down as fast as they would if you were using wands. And if you are not attacking the correct target spot, you might not be causing a physical down. So understanding what you're trying to focus on, what you're trying to do, and balance the pros and cons of the physical and elemental down. Of course, with other classes, such as Fighter, things change a little bit. Fighter gets a lot of damage benefits from a downed enemy. Tchter, not so much, which is probably the reason why Tchter can be fairly versatile and effective when using non-Tchter weapons in these situations. Other than that, it's going to be interesting when new elemental weapons come out, as I'm pretty sure they will. Lightning is not going to be the only one. The main question is going to be is how pervasive are they in the weapon system, or are they going to be kind of these one-time things? That's the thing that's going to be very, very interesting, especially given how they might be limited in their weapon types and their weapon combinations, which is also something else we're going to be mindful of. Right now, Sword and Wired Lance are the only weapons for Hunter that are lightning element. Partisan is not. Will that change when another weapon element is? And gets into the strategy of what weapon should I be using? Is there an enemy who's weak to this specific element where there is a beneficial weapon combination that Tchter can take advantage of versus sticking to Wand, sticking to Talis? Hope this experiment was informative. Of course, we'll be doing more like these. I think my next one's going to be Wave Crash versus Swift Smash or Heavy Hammer, and we'll go from there. Hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll catch you all next time.